this is going to be an account of how we keep our animals. So I wanted to start this episode because there's a few wars going on in the Retic industry about husbandry, keeping, and it's always a hot topic of debate. So the first thing I want to start off with is just identifying there's no cookie cutter way to keep retics. Everyone's going to be keeping them a little bit differently, but what we're going to be doing is just kind of outlining um, just the overall basic husbandry. So, Nathan, jump into temperature while I plug in my laptop because I realize I don't have it plugged in.
Yeah, I mean, temperature for me, I do upper 80s for my hotspot and mid to low 70s for my cool spot. I do a gradient uh in my in my caging. All of my caging runs right now on belly heat. I think in the future I would like to switch that to heat panels and just change up my style of keeping a little bit. Uh, I think I think every keeper though, if you ask them, are they totally dialed in to how they want to be keeping their animals? I think they'd all say that there's adjustments they'd want to make. And you know, I'm happy with where my animals are at right now, but there are a few minor adjustments I want to tweak with my keeping. So, uh, heat panels being one of those. I just feel like the belly heat you have to crank it up a little bit for the heat transfer between the plastic, and I've heard of almost all the fires in the industry happening from heat tape,
Yeah,
and that just scares the hell out of me. So, uh, yeah. What about you, man?
totally. So I think I've had the opportunity to be able to keep my animals on heat tape, and what are those things called? So heat mats. So I've done heat tapes, heat mats, I've done heat panels, and I'm currently now using ambient um to control the entire room. So just for you listeners that are very new at this, there's two different main type of temperatures that you need to measure in your snake's enclosure. The first one is going to be a gradient. So if you are using a heat panel or heat tape or heat mat, anything equal to that, you're going to want to buy a temp gun. So that's going to be an infrared temp gun. You can get them on Amazon for as little as 25 bucks, and they are going to be within 1 degree as accurate as the ones that are $100 in my experience. I have gotten a Milwaukee brand temp gun that was $120. Yes. So for those of you listening, Nathan just got his temp gun out. What brand is that? Because that's the very that I love that brand that's on Amazon.
Etekcity,
Yes.
Etekcity. But yeah, I mean, it's often overlooked by me, but when it comes down to the really important parts of my keeping, um, let's say obviously dialing in a cage, it's gradient hot to cold. But once you have a cage dialed in, you're pretty well set. But
Mhm.
where I find that heat gun comes in really handy is if I have an animal I need to soak, or say it had a dirty cage, any reason I need to soak, I can really dial in the water temperature. They could probably handle cooler water than I give them, but I can dial in that water temperature so I know that they can sit in that water for a good hour or so, and I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to worry about them cooling down, developing an RI, anything like that.
Yeah, totally. The yeah, that temp gun is going to be your best friend throughout. And so when you're keeping your snakes on a gradient, that means that you have a hot side that you're using from an external heat source, which is the panels or the heat tape. And what you want to do is use that temp gun and you're measuring the floor temperature. And like Nathan said, that floor temperature, when I kept with a heat panel or with heat tape, I kept my floor temperature at 88 degrees
Mhm.
as the hotspot. I
Mhm.
even did have some animals at 88 degrees they weren't a fan of, and I drop it down to 86, 86 to 87, and they were a little bit happier, right? I didn't see them
Good.
as active or pushing. And the biggest reason why I noticed that is because the ambient temperature, so that is the temperature of the air inside of the enclosure and inside of the room, was causing that snake to be a little bit hot. So when you're measuring air temperature, Nathan, I don't know if you did this, but when I was using a gradient style heating, on the cool side of my enclosure, I would put a digital thermometer, or just something to measure the temperature. So popular ones on Amazon are Govee. I spent a little bit more money and got a sensor push system, and would even have some mounted in the enclosures. Those are extremely accurate, so that I could also measure the air temperature. And what I found when I was keeping on a gradient, if I had my hotspot in between 86 and 88, and I had my ambient temperature on the cool side in the upper 70s, my snakes were very happy.
That's interesting. No, I've never kept any kind of extra thermometer in the cage to measure air temps. I've just measured floor temps, and then I mean basic air temps by just raising up the thermometer just up into the enclosure. Just the point and shoot. But
Hmm.
that's never been a big concern of mine as long as my floor temps are right. Um,
Yeah.
my my enclosures that I first started out with were only a foot tall, so and I still use them for some of my smaller snakes, but uh, I think now that I have enclosures that are a full 2 foot tall for a couple of the girls, that's a little bit more of a concern. So I have measured and it still stays within the lower 70s up where their shelf is. So nothing
Okay, cool.
nothing concerning. They seem happy, they don't push. They seem to act as happy as they did in their old enclosures, if not a little bit more.
Yeah, when I wasn't measuring air temperatures in the so my very first year of breeding, I came across an issue where my female took 50 days to lay her eggs. And for those of you that aren't familiar, it's typically around 35 days. So I was starting to get
Hmm.
concerned. And what I realized is I had my snakes in my house, like most of you guys have them in your house. I'm assuming if you're buying your first few retics, you don't have a facility to put them in. If you have a temperature controlled room that's separate from the rest of your house, then awesome, you're ahead of the game. But what I found was I had them like in a kind of like where a breakfast table would be next to the kitchen. Super awesome for when guests come in. They're like, "Hey, let me go in the kitchen." And they see a bunch of snakes. I don't recommend having them in an area where a bunch of people can see them, but
Hey, I
um,
don't knock it. Richard Bilbo has his collection set up to where almost every room in the house is snakes, and I think he has the coolest house in all of Utah. So
I need to go there badly. I've seen videos of people going over. I think Reach Out Reptiles did one of going to his place, and yeah, his. I mean, for us, that's like heaven.
yeah, I desperately need to make a trip down there. I can make a pit stop over to Spencer's now, so cut the trip into two pieces. It takes, I think just over 2 hours from me to get over to Richard's house.
Yeah, yeah. So I man, that's a luxury. That's awesome. In San, I don't really think in San Antonio. I mean, we have big retic people over in Houston and other areas in Texas, but I think the closest drive I have to any really big retic keepers is probably 2-3 hours. So I guess pretty similar to you, but back to what I was saying about my first breeding experiences, I would measure. So my female ended up getting gravid, and I was measuring the floor temp of her enclosure at 86 to 88, and I was like, oh,
Hmm.
that okay, we're money, we're good. Um, but I was given some input on after it was like on day 40. Someone told me like, hey, take your temp gun. So remember, your temp gun is going to literally be your best friend, and temp the snake and see what temperature the snake reads. So she was gravid in the months of November and December, and it got cold, and so I I temped her, and her body was only 81, 82 degrees, and I
Mm-hmm.
was like, oh. So that clicked with me, and I realized like, wow, okay, so even if my hotspot's at 88, but the ambient in my, which by the way, the ambient in the room was like 69 to 70 because we had a two-story home, and so if I put the heater on at 70 degrees, the downstairs would be 70 degrees where the snakes were, but my room upstairs would be like 78 and I'd be cooking. Um, and that's when I realized, okay, like I need to start using some external method of heating
Mm-hmm.
that room that the snakes are in to make sure that I can keep that room in like the mid 70s. And my second year of breeding, when I did that, and I made sure um, my hotspot was 88, and my the room, I used an external oil filled radiant heater on a separate thermostat to keep that room at 75 because I have a baby and I can't just have my house super cold with a baby and I can't have it super hot. Um,
Yeah. I mean,
and
on that
she,
note, I mean, I live in Utah in a house built in the 70s with single pane windows, so I think that thing that you had to pull together because you're not used to having to deal with such a cold spike like you did that year, especially, is having that external heat source. I mean, that's something that I just had to do because, if I were to leave this room with just the heat from our heater, it can easily drop below mid 60s and get,
yeah,
a little concerning.
yeah.
When I walk into
So
my
I
snake room
learned
and I feel cold, I just feel like there's a problem.
exactly. I learned that the hard way because that costed me some of my clutch.
Hmm.
Now I made those adjustments, learned from that mistake of my very first year of breeding. In my second year, my female laid on day 35, and fertility rate, everything was better. And so air temperature in the room is important as well when you're using heat panels and uh, heat tape. One thing, so like Nathan, you've used heat tape exclusively,
Exclusively.
right? You haven't used heat panels?
Exclusively.
Yeah, I actually preferred heat tape even when I had panels. And the reason why early on I found out is because if my room temperature is too low, the heat panels don't do the job that they typically do. I even talked to like pro panels on the phone, and they're like, yeah, if you don't keep your room at like 72 degrees, our panels, I wouldn't recommend them. And when they told me I'm not going to recommend my panel to you if your room gets below 72 degrees. That was a big thing because they're losing out on a sale potentially, but they were being very honest, which I really appreciated. So I
Well, when
stuck
you're
with my heat
dealing with a
tape.
heating element, you have to be upfront about that because if it's
Yeah,
overpowering, you're running into issues where it can malfunction and cause fires. So,
totally. Um, so uh, there's also another way of keeping retics, which is to keep them in a fully ambient environment. So, which is what I just switched to back in March. I'm using a mini split with a MISA smart thermostat to control it that I can control on my smart home on my iPhone. And I keep my goal is to kind of replicate the temperatures throughout the year of the dry and rainy season of Indonesia. And so my temperatures range from um, about 81. Sometimes it gets a little bit lower than 81 at nighttime, depending on the outside temperature, up to about 84, 85 at most. But when it hits 85, I get a notification. I switch it immediately and I make sure that it goes down. So I'll touch 85 for a bit and then it starts to go back down. And
hmm.
yeah, I've noticed, my snakes have been digesting really well, very quickly, and have been doing really, really well with the switch to ambient.
Now you mentioned just a minute ago that you're trying your best to keep it to the temperatures of the dry and rainy seasons in Indonesia. Now, are you tracking those temperatures live via just the weather apps, or are you uh, just going off historic highs and lows during those seasons? What are you doing there?
All right, yeah, that's a good question. So, what I did was search through an archive online. So I googled like historical monthly temperatures throughout the months on three different islands: on Kalatoa, on Solaire, and on Ternate Island. And I took those average temperatures for the rainy and the dry season. And so, um, here in San Antonio, the dry season is clearly during the summers and into the fall and part of winter. We do have some rain that comes in the fall, and then uh into once we get into March, rain starts coming again. And so what I do is just go off of that. And so the average temperature low that I saw was actually pretty surprising. It was about like the average low of those three, it can get down into the 60s, which is crazy. But I also have to keep in mind that there's microclimates in each of these, and the sun that hits any rocks and things like that, they are able to keep warm. So I just
Yep.
decided to go with a range from 80 to 85
Yeah,
based off of the
it's a
information and data.
very, I mean, their their air temperature is such a general guideline because you're having to take into account those rocks heating up, the cave systems that some of these animals live in, uh, as well
Humidity.
humidity, the water temperature that these animals are going into in the river systems that they're migrating through. So, I mean, they can handle
Yeah.
probably a wider range than we're comfortable giving them, especially when you look at water temperature. I'm really curious the next time, uh, especially that Daniel Solis goes out. I want to hear what water temperatures are like in some of these river systems that he finds them swimming through.
Yeah, that would be super interesting. I stopped giving, so like when I first started keeping retics, I'd put the water on like cold, right? And I'd fill up their water bowl with nice fresh cold water. And then I started realizing I was like, they don't have cold water, unless it's
Hmm.
it's part of the cold year. And so I started giving them kind of room temp water. And now that my room is ambient, if I do give them cooler water, it's going to raise up to room temperature in no time.
Hmm.
But you mentioned you talked a little bit about humidity, and I was going to say, just in my experience with keeping an ambient, you'd be surprised when my dehumidifier is full of water in the reservoir, and so it's no longer dehumidifying the room. How easy it is for that room temperature to go up quicker when the humidity increases. So that's something to keep in mind in the wild when they're experiencing, rainy season. The humidity increasing is making it feel warmer. Um, that air is feeling warmer, at least my observation with my system setup. But um, so just to recap, so that we didn't go off on a tangent for y'all. Uh, Nathan, you
We
keep
tend
your
to do
hot
that.
side at 88.
Yeah, hot side's 88, 88.5 at the high end. Uh, like you said, it just varies animal to animal. If I see them overactive or acting any way out of the ordinary, I'll drop that temperature down.
And cool side, what do you shoot for?
So I tend to see in my enclosures, my 1 foot enclosures, I get a cool spot probably around 74 to 75, and then the larger enclosures on the floor temperature, I get about 75, and then up on the shelf, I get about 73, 72.5,
Cool.
somewhere around there. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was the same when I was keeping gradient. I would try to aim for a cool side in the mid 70s and a hot side in the mid to upper 80s. Um, One thing that I do want to preface is that your snakes are much safer with cooler temperatures than hotter temperatures. Um,
Absolutely.
I might get some kickback with saying this, but a lot of keepers um, a decade ago and even now, like to have a hot spot of 90 degrees. And if your snake
That's
is
how I started
reacting
out.
well to that, yeah, me too, 90. I found that I started dropping them because I started finding my snakes pacing more at a higher
Hmm.
temperature. And the issue I didn't like about 90 is that for whatever reason, if whatever's monitoring your air temp in your room, whether it's an external heat source or your house AC conditioner, that goes out. It doesn't take much to get that 90 degree to go up to 91 or to 92. And once you get to that, it long term for your snake, it's not good for their health. So I liked the buffer of mid to upper 80s. That way I had a 2 degree buffer to that 90 degree hotspot to make sure that their health and their well being was taken care of.
It's much easier to manage some cold temperatures and bump up than, have potentially altering effects from high temperatures. You're talking neurological effects, death.
Yeah.
There's so many bad things that can happen from heat. That's why so many of us don't ship it during the peak summer months. I mean, it's a lot easier to ship an animal with some heat packs than it is to ship an animal and hope that it doesn't get stuck at a hub for a couple days in the midsummer.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And um so you're in Utah. What do you try to hit your humidity at?
Yeah, so my philosophy on humidity, even here in Utah, one of the driest states in the country, uh, is just providing a large enough reservoir water dish for them to submerge themselves in. Now, I believe a lot of keepers are spraying, and I need to reach out to Utah keepers to see personally what they're doing and what has worked for them over the years, especially Richard, since he's been keeping such a long time and breeding successfully. But uh, the only time I really miss down is when I see them going through a shed cycle. I like to just bump up the humidity a little extra when I notice them go into blue, and I if I hit that, I generally have complete sheds, no issues, no stuck sheds, and yeah, I mean, as long as you're getting that, your snake's healthy, eating, digesting, drinking, I think you're fine.
Yeah. So you're definitely in a unique situation for all of those that are in very dry states, and I guess it's really not that unique. I lived in Florida and now I'm in like the central southern part of Texas, so humidity is not
Hmm.
really an issue for me. So it's not necessarily unique, but um, so what I have so humidity is important, um, very important, but I think what it really goes down to in terms of getting good sheds it really comes down to like their water intake.
Hmm.
I have had times where I've had snakes have perfect sheds with my humidities in my room measured at like 40. Um, and I think that's because like my method, like Nathan was saying, he sprays down while they're in blue, and that helps him out. What I did, and what I still do, is when I notice a snake is in blue, um, right when they're just about coming off of that blue stage, I soak them and I leave them in there for 45 minutes of a standard water soak. I aim for a water temperature of 78 to 81, 82. Um, and I soak them for about 45 minutes to an hour.
Hmm.
I'll pull them out, I'll put them in the cage, and I get nearly perfect sheds every time. Um,
Hmm.
Also, keep in mind with sheds, with retics, once you start to get some longer retics like 8 feet, 9 feet, perfect sheds rarely happen. So it's
They
not
do,
like
but
keeping a corn.
yeah.
Do yours have good sheds often? Like perfect, or like there's no rips or tears?
As long as I manage their blue cycle, then yeah. So if I soak them, if I spray them down, and I'm managing their humidity through their shed cycle, most of the time. Now, like you were going to say, it's a 9 foot snake. You're talking, upwards of 10 pounds. They're moving around the cage. They're using their body weight to get that shed off. So absolutely rips and tears happen.
Yeah, it's not going to be one of those nice ball python sheds where you can pull out and like hold perfectly all the time. Now, I do get those even with some of my bigger snakes, but the larger that they start to get, the longer that they get, the more chances they have of ripping it just because of their body weight and the force that they're using to get the shed off. Um, but yeah, so my method is I soak. Nathan sprays. Um,
I do a
Spraying is
little bit of
probably
both.
okay. Cool.
I do a little bit of both, but I tend to just spray, and then if I have any issues, or like every once in a while there'll be tiny little patches or whatever, I'll soak them for an hour and then that's off.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah. So when you don't have a good shed and they have a stuck shed, definitely soaking is the best way to help them with that. Um,
Absolutely.
so yeah. I believe a large part of having good sheds and the health of the snake has to do with humidity, but I think it equally is important that they're hydrated. So in order for that snake to be hydrated well, um, you need to have fresh water in their bowl available at all times, and if not, as often as you can. And the reason I guess I say as often as you can is because life happens, stuff happens, and you might not be able to get to it right away. um, but try to do it as much as you can, as frequently as you can. If you have the time to give your snake fresh water daily, go for it. Like, I can't express the importance of water, but
So I
um,
need to stop you here. So this has been, I wouldn't say controversial just because I mean, in my practices, this is how I've operated. But there's been people calling out other keepers and how they replace their water and how uh, some people think it's common practice to do water changes, weekly. And I think, and this is just a total shot in the dark, but I'm guessing you replace your waters every other day or every 2 days, 3 days at the most,
yeah,
unless you're
three
on
three.
vacation.
So yeah, 3 days is what I shoot for on the long shot.
Yeah. It's not, I mean, would you let a cup of water sit on your counter for 5 days and then take a drink of that water? All
Yeah.
the
So
sediment from the air has been settling in it. I mean, it's just, if it's not healthy for you, would it be healthy for your animal, kind of a thing,
yeah,
is how I
exactly.
approach that.
Yeah, I think that the idea of replacing water on a weekly basis is, in my opinion, too long. Because whenever I replace my water, like I mentioned, at the most I try to go 3 days. I have gone 4 days. Again, life happens, but it's 2 to 3 days. And the reason why is because when I notice I get to around day 5, if I'm on vacation or whatever the case may be, and I empty that water bowl, the bottom is slimy. The water
Hmm.
bowl has like the water has a residue on it. Um, and not to mention, by the time I hit day 3, more than likely, most of my snakes will have urates or poop stains
Hmm.
on the water bowl. And that is clearly not healthy for your animals. So yeah, I mean, it is a big debate, and it is a big debate right now in the industry, but I'm going to err on the side of the more frequent water changes, the better. Um,
Yeah, the more healthy your animals are going to be. Um, I've seen keepers that have had this massive revelation of this, and they've been keeping for 20 plus years, and for me, it's just like, how is this not common sense to you? This is water is the source of life. It's what keeps us living. It's what keeps us healthy. Why would it not be what keeps every other living thing healthy and thriving? So, yeah,
yeah.
that's a big thing. A lot of old school keepers need to really look at, I think.
Yeah, and I think it really just comes down to, if you're not replacing your water every 3 days or so, um, I mean, even if we extend that to 4 days, but if you're
I'm not
not,
no, I'm not going to harp on you. I mean, you can go the random week or so if you have to take off, go on vacation, you have no one else to help you. Like,
yeah,
there's a point where you have to, take your chances and be able to live your life to be able to continue keeping these animals. But as soon as you're getting home, what's the first thing you're doing? You're going into your snake room and you're dealing with all those dirty cages, dirty water bowls to make sure that your animals are happy and thriving.
yeah, and I think where a lot of keepers get away from doing it frequently is when they end up having a collection that's too large to do it that often.
Yeah,
And if that's
that's
the case, then that's something that you have to kind of just see if you're keeping your animals at the best of for their well-being, and if it's not for the best of their well-being, then that's just a conversation you have to have with yourself in the mirror, right?
yeah. But I mean, there's it's it's like anything else. There's
I'm
philosophies
not
on how
taking
to
a
do
sip of
this.
water in a glass that's been sitting for 4 days.
No, no, nor
I'm gonna pour it out and get a new fresh glass of water.
absolutely. Yeah. Uh, it's common sense to me. The whole water debate, but it's worth it at least bringing up, especially since we're talking husbandry tonight.
Yeah, 100%. So humidity. While I keep in ambience of while I keep ambient temperatures, I try to aim for a room humidity of 60%. I have a humidifier if I need it. I haven't
Hmm.
really needed it at all. I actually need a humidifier to keep it. So again, I keep a little Govee square. I'm doing this weird square thing on video for those of you that are listening, but does that even look like a square? That's a square. Okay. So I keep one of those in there to measure the humidity inside because I realized when I was keeping my garage at 60% humidity, which is ideal for retics, in my opinion, what's worked for me, my cages were actually like 15% higher. And so I have my dehumidifier set to 50. And so that gives me about a humidity of 60, 65. Um, so that's where I aim for humidity, because if you look at what the humidity is in Indonesia, again, guys, I can't stress the importance. Like, know where your animals are from, know what the temperatures are, know what the humidity is. Um, it's a jungle in most, if not all, of Indonesia. So therefore,
And
it's going to
especially
be
these dwarfs and super dwarfs are living in cave systems. Have any of you
that
been
are
in a
wet.
cave? Yeah,
Yeah,
it's not dry in a cave.
no, it's not. Um, but here is the concern about humidity with retics. Another husbandry 101 that I think is important to talk about is cleanliness and how frequently you clean and the type of like bedding and husbandry that you have. We won't go into a bunch of detail because that could be a whole other episode. But if you're keeping your room humidity or your cage humidity at 60 and your snake pees and then sits in that pee for a long time, that humidity spikes. And what happens when humidity spikes and you're creating an environment with a hot spot or warm temperatures? Bacteria grows.
Mhm.
So keep that in mind, because
Not only
bacteria
that,
is,
most of our enclosures are dark, so it's a warm, dark spot with a high humidity spike. That is the perfect place for bacteria to thrive.
yeah. And when bacteria thrives and you're not on top of your husbandry, that's where RIs become an issue, and which stands for respiratory infection. And so when respiratory infections are when there's a host of bacteria and a recipe for disaster, respiratory infections can definitely increase. So um, that's why we are talking about humidity in this husbandry 101. You want to create a balance of hydration, humidity, and cleanliness to keep your snakes healthy and happy.
I don't think I have
So,
much more to add on humidity. We've hit about everything we can on basic temperature. I do want to add in, um, it is imperative that you're using a thermostat. As elementary as that sounds, uh, there's people getting into this brand new that may have kept a Reptile 15 years ago using a plug-in heat rock and thought that was fine, and they probably view heat tape the same way. So having a
guilty.
good thermostat is extremely important. It can melt your tubs. It can short out, cause fires because it's running too high. It's just a host of problems that you don't want for your animals, for your house, for anything in your life. My personal recommendation has been Spider Robotics Herpstat. Any of the thermostats in that lineup are absolutely phenomenal. I know Freedom Breeder makes a solid uh, thermostat, as well as Vivarium Electronics. I'm sure there's a handful of others that I'm leaving out, but have a good thermostat that's going to regulate all of the heat sources to your enclosures.
Yeah. Nathan, you just discussed like right there in that last sentence. So a thermostat is to regulate the temperature of your heat source and make sure it doesn't overheat, and make sure it maintains an accurate temperature. I've used Spider Robotics Herbstats; they're phenomenal. I've used Freedom Breeders, phenomenal.
Mhm.
I've used Vivarium Electronics, great, great thermostats. I've even used Inkbird thermostats on Amazon that you can get for $50, and they've done the job. So, and Inkbird even has thermostats as low as like $40. So there's no excuse to not have a thermostat to regulate the temperature of your heat source. Um, we'll I'll drop the links. We'll drop the links to all of these different brands and where you can buy them, in the description below, for you guys to just have an easy access of clicking and purchasing if you guys want to, as well as the temp guns and the Govee. We'll make sure that that's all
Water
available for you
dishes,
guys.
anything that we can find that we use personally, we will link down in the
Yeah.
description pertinent to the episode. I mean, Husbandry 101, this is an episode that we're probably going to have to break into two, three parts to hit all of the subjects we need to hit. But in all of these episodes that we drop, we'll have a list of as much as we can of what we talked about through this episode.
Nathan, what else do you think is important for basic husbandry for this episode that's important for our listeners to know?
As far as the topics that we're really covering today, I think we hit everything. One maybe really minor detail that I left out as far as misting goes. Uh, I I have found in the past that uh, when I use tap water, or if you have any kind of hard tap water, it can destroy your misters over time. So I've always just invested into distilled water. That always helps just keep my equipment clean. As far as water dishes, I just go straight tap water because it's easiest. I'm not dumping gallons of distilled water and having just gallons in my storage at all times. So, that's super minor, super, super minor. Anything you want to hit on before we go?
Yeah. So, I have the luxury. I'm lucky enough to have a water softener that's made that easy. So if you guys have a house and you have the money to invest in a water softener, not only is it great for your house and your appliances and all that good stuff, but it's going to make the water softer for your animals as well. I have, prior to me getting a water softener, yeah, I would just use tap water. And it's a good point to make. Know how hard your water is in your area. If it's within your means to get distilled water to be able to replace for your snakes, go for it. There's no issue with doing that. It's a little more costly, but if that's something that you want to do. Do you have any experience using? I have not in my. I never use those droplets of like the water. There's like those droplets you could buy at Petco or on
Yeah.
Chewy or Amazon that like take out whatever is in the distilled water.
No, my water hasn't been too bad. Salt Lake City's water's not terribly hard, so I just have have found that my tap water has worked for my animals, and I also use a little bit of copper in my water, so
Yeah,
it is an
I, I, I
additive.
u- I used to do that when I didn't have a water softener, and it's crazy. I bought a big thing of copper wire and I'd cut them and I'd put them in the bowl, and you'd be surprised how much less residue and that gooiness on the bottom occurs when you can put pure copper or as close to pure copper as possible into their water bowl. It was actually when I did that little experiment. I saw that video on Reach Out Reptiles um, a while back, probably close to a couple years ago, and experimented with that, and it worked really well to keep the residue from building in those water bowls to keep it a little bit more fresh.
Yeah, it's especially nice to have it in there. Just a little peace of mind knowing your water's not getting terribly dirty when you're out of town for 4 or 5 days, whatever. All right, man. I think we hit as much as we can on those couple topics that we're going to jump into for our first intro into Husbandry 101. So, Lucas, I want to thank you for joining me tonight. I want to thank everyone who's been listening and watching in for joining us on the Retic Lounge. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe on whatever platform you are listening or watching, and that helps us just tremendously. Remember, we also have a Patreon going. Become a lounger today. Check out the tiers and the access that each tier gives you. As well, we have USARC. It's more important than ever that you show their support, show that our member numbers are up, and that we mean something. So go over to their YouTube, subscribe to their YouTube, go over to their Instagram, follow them over there, donate, become a member, make your spouse a member, make your child a member, make your cousin a member, make your coworker a member. Get it done. Thanks, Lucas.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nathan. You guys have a good night, and cheers.